comment on the, the title was TIF's TODs and something else. And if you don't know what TOD is, it's transit-oriented development. And before I get into it, I'll just say I haven't always been a member of the vast right-wing conspiracy. Actually, in a prior career, I spent 20 years working for environmental organizations, and so I'm actually predisposed to think that transit-oriented developments are a good idea. But it turns out empirical evidence crashed into my preference, and that actually meant something to me, whereas it doesn't mean very much to most transit planners and land use planners and politicians in Portland, where we have a faith-based policy approach. Now, before I started at Cascade almost 10 years ago, Cascade is a free market think tank that's now in its 15th year, and I've been there since January of 1997, first as an environmental analyst, and now I'm president. Well, before that, I was executive director of the Oregon Environmental Council for almost 17 years, and so I was head of it, and I was the chief lobbyist. And before that, I worked in New York for the Environmental Defense Fund, now called Environmental Defense. So I spent 20 years, out doing environmental advocacy work and believing in a lot of things that light rail advocates say. And I grew up 20 miles from New York City, so I know all about trains and subways, and I used to be a commuter rail user myself, and I'm not quite as much of a train nut as Randall O'Toole. I mean, I don't actually own trains, full-scale trains like he has owned, but I like trains, and it's kind of embarrassing to admit this, but in 1995, I actually moved out of downtown Portland, far to the east side of Portland, out toward the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. And one reason I looked only on the east side and nowhere else, because I could have moved theoretically anywhere, was because the only light rail line at the time went at 15.5 miles to the east side, and I wanted to become a rail commuter again, so I looked only on the east side, and I did buy a house. Of course, I didn't buy a house near light rail. Like most people, I bought a house far from light rail, and then drove in 20 miles to get on light rail. The reward being, of course, I always got a seat because I sprawled far beyond light rail being an inducer of sprawl, not a preventer of sprawl, contrary to the smart growth propaganda of today. But then I got on light rail, and I was kind of figuring out how you do all this. And when you're on the train for 45 minutes, traveling at about 18 miles per hour, you have a lot of time to think about why this really isn't working out as well as you thought. I mean, here I bought one of the most important things you can do. I buy a house on the east side, and this thing is going super slow. Like, what's up with this? I know about the New York Express subway and the commuter rail, and we used to really zip along there. What's with this stupid little two-car train that creeps along? And so between that and actually becoming a subscriber to Reason Magazine in 1992, that was kind of the part of my quick conversion and growing out of the whole environmental movement scene. And plus, in the environmental movement, especially in Oregon, you can say lots of things like, they thought it was great when I was promoting congestion pricing, because as far as my colleagues were concerned, that meant I was punishing motorists so we could take all their money and build rail boondoggles. But as soon as you start to criticize things like urban growth boundaries and light rail, well then you don't actually have a choice about your next career move. You're going to get excommunicated from the church, so you got to figure out something to do. And fortuitously, I wound up at Cascade working at this, as a think tanker, wondering, well, like, what does that mean? What do I even do? So that's how and when I arrived at Cascade, the smart growth, I think the smart growth phrase was sort of coined by Paris Glendening, the ex-governor. No? Yes?
You said a name.
Right. But I mean, of course, Portland's been doing a lot of that stuff for decades, but the movement sort of burst onto the scene, and when I got to Cascade, suddenly there was this lot of interest all over the country, the Portland was this iconic city of regional governance and urban growth boundaries and light rail, and so people are always wondering about what was going on in Portland. And so I sort of ended up studying this a lot because we kept getting phone calls, and people kept visiting from all around the world to learn about Portland. And they called me, and I figured, well, I work at a market-oriented place. I can respond to market demand. If people want to know about all this stuff, I guess I should learn. And I am a light rail rider. I've now ridden it probably 15,000 times. So, like I said, I've had a lot of time to think about this and look into the literature. And so it turns out transit-oriented development, the short phrase for it is just that it's high-density, mixed-use projects that are built preferably within a quarter-mile radius of a transit stop. And it could be a bus stop, but at least among Portland area or West Side Oregon planners, they're utterly contemptuous of rubber-tired road-based transit. I mean, that's for barbarians. For TODs to really be TODs, they have to be, rail-based, because that's going to be a catalyst for development. And so that's what transit-oriented development is. And I don't know that Oregon pioneered it exactly, except that in the early 1990s, the regional government of Portland spent 4 years lobbying FTA to be able to spend money that traditionally had been restricted just to the steel wheels part of transit. They actually persuaded them that some money could be siphoned off for off-site projects related to the rail if it was called transit-oriented development. And so, to that extent, Oregon's been a pioneer for this bad idea of transit-oriented development. Well, it's not inherently a bad idea, it's just utterly overrated. So, well, what do we actually know about TOD? It turns out not very much. I mean, there's a book called Travel by Design. I think it's written by Randall Crane and Marlon Burnett, and it's very academic and pretty quantitative, and I mean, more quantitative than I'm ever going to be. And it's a great source if you're actually, you want to really get into this, you can get their book. I've always been more interested in terms of all the stuff going on about Portland and the great mythology of Portland. And I like to just go out and study these projects and get up early and between 6 and 9 in the morning and just observe how people travel at these things as opposed to how they say they travel and how a lot of academics say. And, some people get famous by watching gorillas in the jungle, and I sit and watch people at TODs, and that's why I'm not famous, and they are. But you can learn a lot by doing that, and you can learn that in fact not very much is known. Although, I mean, a central part of it is in the philosophy of Portland planners that we're going to spend billions of your tax money that our congressional delegation stole from you to build these trains, and then the trains don't serve us. We have to use zoning and regulation and subsidies to serve the train. It's our job. We are, as patriots, we must serve the train, which needs high density, of course. So they go through unbelievable tactics of upzoning and just cramming this stuff down our throats and bribing developers till their pockets are practically falling down with money to build these projects. Because the truth is, rail does not attract development. It repels high-density development. You have to bribe developers to actually do this. And that's a story that people don't hear when they come to Portland and get the standard light rail tour where they get on a train and they go to somewhere and they see this nice, spiffy new building and they say, wow, the train is here, the building is there, there must be a causal relationship, it all worked. Okay, sure, if you don't care how many millions of dollars we spent per marginal trip to get the next rider on, I guess it works, So we don't really know very much, and especially to the extent that anyone in the business cares about it. And someone on the bus asked a question yesterday, one of the speakers, about what do you actually know when these projects get built about actual transit use, and the guy laughed. He said, oh, we don't know anything. Well, that seems to be pretty much endemic to the profession, is that they build something or they subsidize the private sector to build something and then they go on to the next project, and the last thing they really want to know is how the project worked, because that would be, empirical evidence would be threatening to their theory, of course. And so what you will find when you see some data tends to be surveys rather than observations of people. I see some of these academics, they'll go to some place and they'll get questionnaires and they'll ask people a lot of questions about how they used to travel and now they're here, how do they travel, et cetera, et cetera. But I tend to think, especially on questions of transit use, that this questionnaire data is pretty suspect compared to day-to-day use. People know how they are expected to respond, and you kind of, if you were to go to some highbrow group like the Portland City Club and stand up and ask, for instance, just a little survey here, how many of you regularly buy adult videos? Like probably nobody would raise their hand. and you do a little research. Gee, is the adult video industry doing well? Yeah, doing great. Apparently, someone's buying this stuff, but no one's willing to admit it. Now, of course, I personally have no knowledge of that. That's my story, and I'm sticking with it. But like John Caldera, he tells me the adult video business is booming, that he does know about it. So, see, but people don't. Hacked into my database. Okay, so people, are rarely honest. And my observation, having spent a lot of cold mornings between 6 and 9 in the morning with some other volunteers, quasi-volunteers that I sort of roped into surrounding some building and very carefully doing mode trip analyses about how many people come out and walk away and drive away and get on the train, et cetera, is that I don't care what people say about how they travel. But when you sit, especially in the very high-density upscale area called the Pearl District of Portland, the most common thing you see at about 6:30 in the morning is an underground garage door opening and some very affluent person coming out in a Jaguar, Beamer, or SUV, and the streetcar at the 5 miles per hour that it travels goes by once every 15 minutes and is utterly ignored by the people because their value of time is, of course, much higher than that. And then they drive away in what I call an urban bedroom community because they're then going out to Nike or Intel or somewhere out in the burbs, which is theoretically served by the train, but why would you bother? Because the train's too slow. So we don't really know much. And furthermore, there's a problem of self-selection, which is that a lot of people who live in TODs, if they're transit-oriented, if they're transit-dependent, they're going to be there anyway. I mean, look, there's about 77 train stops in Portland, and there's about 6,000 bus stops. So, I mean, rubber-tired transit, of course, can have ubiquitous coverage, which is one reason why it's so much more sensible than fixed guideway transit. And you have to wonder, well, if they're there, even if there's higher than average use of the train in a TOD, which frequently there is, wouldn't they be using transit anyway? A lot of these people somewhere else on a bus route that was maybe 1/100th the cost of the train. And those problems are very difficult to sort out. Now, how much time, Kathleen?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Okay. I've done a couple of case studies about transit-oriented development in Portland to try to debunk the myth. And I'm doing some more because this is the 20th anniversary of Eastside Max. And I hope to one of these days sort of publish it as a little book. And unlike Wendell Cox, I'm not going to promise when it comes out because I know it's not going to come out this year. Maybe next year, who knows. But one of them, for those of you who were in Portland for the trip or the conference a couple years ago, I led a tour, and one of the places was this place called Center Commons Project, which was a 5-acre site. It used to be a DMV site, and the DMV was actually relocated to a place more politically correct, and this site was redeveloped into a high-density TOD that had 314 residential units, 65 units per acre, which is pretty high density, only 0.61 parking spaces per unit, which is way below the market rate. I mean, the market rate would be minimum 1 parking space per unit, and typically 2 for what actual people want, not planners. And also they had a mixed income. They had some market rate townhomes there, so the utopian goal was to have some upscale yuppies mixed in with some low-income housing and seniors, and we'd all meet out in the commons and build a campfire and sing Kumbaya and take the train.
Isn't there a code for parking? I can't believe you could get by with these all one-bedroom units. Or?
Well, this is about 100 yards, not even 100 yards, 50 yards from a light rail station. So the closer you get to light rail, the more off-street parking is prohibited.
My point is, so there was no parking built with the unit?
Well, yeah, it was 0.61 off-street parking spaces per unit.
0.61?
Yeah. And because you're near light rail, so you're supposed to be punished with lack of parking availability because you're going to take the train, right? And if you're not, we assume away any other possible outcome. So anyway, so this was the first TOD in the country subsidized by FTA. They were finally talked, after 4 years of lobbying, they were talked into allowing some money to be taken away from the train itself and used for a sidewalk to go from one street, a parallel street, to where the train track was, and go through this TOD and then go up to the train tracks, which was cost them about $265,000. And as I showed people on the tour, it turns out that the sidewalk goes through this little area they were calling a winter, I think is it's a European term for some little area where people are supposed to be all pedestrians and no cars. But the trouble is, because the whole Todd was underbuilt for parking, every single time I've been to this place for research over the last 5 years, which is 40 or 50 times, right at that area, the cars all block the sidewalk. So you can't actually use the sidewalk, even though you all, through FTA, subsidize it. It's completely useless. But we've already spent the money, so no one cares. I mean, there's no penalty for being wrong, for government planners. So, so it turns out there's a huge shortage of parking. There's a private street, internal, a U thing, and it's 20 feet wide. And in the documents for this, it says clearly 20 feet wide means no parking on either side of the street. If you want to have parking, you got to have 28 feet wide. Well, people who actually live there, they all park on this one side of the street, and they always have since the beginning because there's a shortage of parking. And after a couple years of research, I finally felt I had an obligation to call the fire department and say, there's a 5-story senior unit here. You're waiting. You're about to see one of these days a huge problem of getting fire trucks in here. They're violating the code. This is a city-sponsored project. Why don't you go in there and do something about it? And they said, oh, that's important. They never did anything about it. Every time I go back there now, there's still cars parked illegally everywhere. And yet, this is classic what happens with planners. When I later called the PDC planner who was in charge of this project, because the Portland Development Commission is the urban renewal arm for Portland, and then it was built by private sector people. It's a $30 million project with $13 million of subsidies, including below-cost land sales and low-income housing tax credits and grants and an array of other subsidies. I said, I just asked her, I didn't want to lead her, I just said, do you think there's adequate parking there? And she says, well, yeah, there's very tight parking ratios, and it's next to light rail, so there is no parking problem. I said, well, have you been there since it opened? And she said, well, no, but we know there's not a parking problem. Okay, and I said, well, do you think it's a success? She said, oh, yes, it's a success. I said, well, what's your criteria? She said, well, the day it opened, it became a success. Oh, okay. So, but then she retired soon thereafter with the nation's most generous public employee retirement system, in which we actually have quite a few people in Oregon, public employees, who retire at about 120% of their final salary. And they're at age 53 or so. Then they immediately contract back to the agency, which she did. Look, she's on to her next project. Empirical evidence about this lemon, I mean, that would get in the way of the party, So, there's just, so I've been studying this for 5 years and done a friend of my trip counts, and I'm going to write this up more later this year. And then I know because I'm running out of time. One last one I'll just talk about, a case study that some of you might have a chance to see sometime, is the Cascade Station out at the Portland airport. If you ever fly to Portland, you can take light rail. And the rail was built in '01, or opened in '01, prophetically just the day before the terrorist attacks. And the real point of it was not to actually, because they thought a lot of people would take it to the airport, but because it was through this open area. There was 120 acres of prime real estate that they wanted to convert to a gigantic Todd. So they got Bechtel to actually build the train. Bechtel put equity in primarily. They didn't care about the train. They just wanted to get the raw land, and they partnered with Trammell Crow. And after 5 years, not a spade of dirt had been moved. And this train kept going through this open field because all the zoning was wrong. I mean, they prohibited any store with a footprint of more than 65,000 square feet because they didn't want big box retail. And yet, everyone who was associated with it knew that was absurd. So finally, actually, just last year, they conceded defeat. They changed to allow one store of over 200,000 square feet, but only one, a nice little cartel arrangement, and then one for 160,000 square feet. So just about 2 weeks ago, I went to the groundbreaking for IKEA. They're the ones who got the super big site. Typical Portland. They wouldn't let in some low-life place like Walmart, but a European big box, that's like a lot better, So I went to the groundbreaking, and it happens to be sited on this 120 acres as far away from light rail as it can possibly get. And then Costco is going to be over here, and they're going to anchor it, and then they hope to have nice other little boutique stores. But the notion that you would go to IKEA on light rail, buy your gigantic thing, and then go out, like, I mean, it's unbelievable. That's life in Portland. It's like one gigantic Hollywood movie set with just a bunch of false fronts. So my suggestions to you is, if you have a chance, is to look especially at subsidies. My experience is none of these things are market-based. The higher density you get with steel and elevators and structured parking and the most expensive unionized labor out there of crane operators and steel workers. These things are so financially infeasible. They're going to be subsidized, and then the train itself, of course, is massively subsidized. So especially in a place like Portland that likes to brag we're into sustainability, you have to wonder, gee, when we have massive negative cash flow, that's not really a sustainable business model. And then parking demand, planned parking demand versus actual, the extent to which they externalize their parking to all the surrounding neighborhoods and piss off all the neighbors because they have artificially tight ratios. They call it a success because they don't count all the neighbors who are now mad because you've parked on their street. And they frequently project transit use in their planning documents, and so it's good to go and check real transit use versus projected. And I think because this is happening all around the country, this is a fruitful area for you and wherever you live, is to, especially in public-private partnerships where because it's public, you can typically get all the planning documents. It's a really good way to do some close-up investigation and compare what the planners envision versus how it actually turned out. Because I'm not aware in any case that it really turned out the way the planners wanted. Typically, it's financially infeasible, the ridership is lower than projected, and the parking is inadequate. And you can use this to make a very strong case as to what's wrong with this whole approach. So.
All right.